Alright everybody, welcome back to another Ask a Dev Unreal Engine tutorial. Today we're kind of continuing on our UI tutorial series, and we're also talking about materials. My name's Kevin. We're going to be hopping straight in. What we are trying to do today is use one material that can be used for all of our buttons in two different ways. And today we're going to be talking about it specifically from more of a texture-based solution as opposed to more of a procedural, because this is going to teach us two things. One, it's going to teach us a bit about packaging materials, but also if we stumble through it piece by piece, I think you'll learn a lot about how just materials work in general, and we'll be able to use this in our UI. So with that, let's hop in. If you recall, if you did not watch actually, or if you recall from our last UI tutorial video, what we were talking about at one point was why it was that I had set up this button texture to be this single color red with green background. And the reason for that is because what I'd like to do is I would like to use these colors to pull this apart in order to create masks that we can use to drive all of our dreams as far as buttons go. So for example, you can see here, if I just turn off green and blue, I have a really nice mask that I can use for the border of a button. If I turn on green only, you'll notice that I have the reverse mask, where what I've got is the black border. So how are we going to use this single texture map to create a button that allows us to change the border and the fill color with gradients? Let's do it. So what we're going to do in our texture folder is I'm just going to create a new material. And we're going to call this our master material. Let's call this the master material for square buttons. Square button. Or button square. Button square. Because it has the square edges as an example. And what we're going to do is we're going to open this up. I'm going to make a couple quick changes here. The first one I want to change is, if you've never worked with the material editor, it works a lot like other graphs. It's visual, it's node based, there's a lot of cool things that we can do. One of the things that you need to know is this first node that is created, this is the output. Whatever we connect into this is what's going to display. Over here on our left, this is what the current output looks like. So for example, you don't need to do this, but if I just connect 0 to the base color, my sphere turns black. Okay? Now, because of metallic and specular and all of these other things, you'll notice that there was kind of a sheen to it. If I feed 0 into all of these things, so there's no shinies, there's no specular, etc., it becomes black. Point here is things from the left feed into our final result, and that's what it looks like. Now, we're going to actually change this because we're going to be working in the UI space. So one of the things that we want to do down here on the left in our material, instead of surface, I'm actually going to choose user interface, and that is going to change significantly the amount of options that we have that feed into this button. Okay, so with that, let's start from the basics. First, let's make our green and red square show up. So to do that, we need what is called a texture parameter 2D. All right, it's a texture sampler parameter 2D. And the way this works is it basically just feeds straight into your final color, and whatever color that is, it will display on screen, and we can use it in our widgets, for example. Now, the reason we chose texture parameter 2D, and the whole point of this, is because much like blueprints and many other things, you can have a master material. That's why we called this MM button square. This is master material for button square. Later on, you might change the type of silhouette that you use for your button. Maybe you want rounded buttons, whatever. The point is you'll be able to change this. So let's go ahead and use our material, which I believe is called UI Intro Gray. Let's go UI, this one. Okay, so very simply, we have connected our final color to the final color of our button. Now you'll notice that there's lots of bleeding over here in the edges. That's because I didn't do a great job in making this texture. And what I want to do over here on the right, you'll notice right now, it is a solid square. That's not what I want. I want the corners to be uh, transparent. So we're going to change our material, the blend mode, to be masked. Not translucent, but masked. Okay? And when we apply that, what we can do is, let's see here. Actually, we don't have an alpha channel. Maybe we do. Let's do something here. Let's take our RGB and multiply it by the alpha and feed this in. There we go. That worked. For some reason, this RGBA channel was not being handled properly. Okay, so hold on, back up. What did you just do, Freeman? All right, so here's what we did. We took our colors. This is RGB. And we fed that and we multiplied it by our alpha, okay? So let me just change this. I'm gonna multiply by 1 first. And what we can do in our material editor is we can debug what's happening. We're gonna be doing this a lot today as I explain to you the math that's happening. Right now what we're looking at is we're looking at the final color. That's what's showing up here. But if I right click on this multiply node, I can say start previewing node. And what that means is it is going to show me what everything that feeds into this node looks like over here on the left. So if instead of feeding in RGB, I just feed in the alpha, you'll notice that I have an alpha channel that just looks white. That's it. So if I'm wondering, what does the alpha for this texture look like? I can just feed it into here, take a look at the preview. I know what it looks like. I could open it back up in Photoshop or whatever, but it's just easier for me to do that. So what I'm doing is I am taking the color, multiplying it by the alpha, okay, and the alpha was black at the edges and white in the middle, and so anything times 1 is what? 1. Anything times 0 is what? 0. So if I take these edges out here and I multiply them by 0, they're going to get 0, and that is why we have effectively trimmed off the corners, and our final result is what we want it to be. So here we go. Now our final image looks like the shape of our button. But what we want to do here is we want to separate this out. I want to use the red border as our border and the green middle as our fill color so that I can change this on the fly. So let's change this a little bit. Let's take our red channel and multiply it by our alpha, and you'll notice that what we get is we get a nice white color. That's great, because the reason that's great is what we can do is we can now, what's white is 1. What's 1 times any color? The same thing. So for example, if we just simply wanted to test whether or not our border color works, what we can do is we can create a constant 3. All right, what this does is this creates a constant for us that is a color. It's easier for me. Let's just do this. All right, we're gonna take this and we're gonna multiply it. All right, so let's take our constant 3 and multiply it by the output of our red times our alpha and feed this in. This is going to be black. The reason this is black is because our constant is black. If I change this to red, we get red. If I change this to green, we get green. Why? Because green times 1, which is basically what this white color is, right? Green times 1 is going to give us green. Black times 1 is going to give us black, and so on. Okay, so we can adjust our colors a little bit by doing this. Now, I'm actually going to right click on this node and I'm going to convert this to a parameter. And I'm going to convert this to a parameter because I want this to be the border color. And what that does is it makes it so that when we create instances of this material, the person who creates the instance can quickly change the border color without thinking about it. Now, just for clarity, because we're working with greens and reds a lot right now, I'm going to change this to hot pink for right now. I'm going to stop previewing this, and you'll notice that right now we have a hot pink border. Okay, great, that works. Now what we want is we want to get our center. So if we take our green channel and we multiply it by our alpha, and we take a look at what that looks like, we get our white center. That's great. However, you're thinking if we take and we do the same thing we did with border color, instead we call this fill color. The way I did that is I just picked the border color node, press Control C, and I press Control V to create a fill color. I'm going to change this fill color to be, let's go blue. All right, and then what I want to do is I want to multiply these two just like we did above, and you're going to start to understand how some of this math does not work. Let's start previewing the mode. So we have a pink border and we have a blue fill. So you would think we could just add these together to get our final image, right? Well, let's try that. If we just do an add, we stop previewing, and we feed this in, we get our final color. Actually, it works pretty well. So what we can do though, or what we might need to do, is we might need to make sure that these values aren't going beyond what they should be. So what do I mean by that? Actually, no, let's just leave that at that. Right now we have our fill color and we have our border color. That's perfect. But what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to maybe add a gradient to our fill. Well, to do that, what we can do is let's take a gradient. We're going to take a gradient, a linear gradient. Okay, and I am going to preview this. And you can see this is what it looks like. Okay, and what I want to do is I want to multiply that gradient by our fill color, which is here. Okay, so let's multiply this. And I'm just piecing this together. I don't want it horizontal, I want it vertical, so I'm going to multiply it by the vertical. All right, so if we preview this now, what you'll see is you see the blue gradient where it's sort of darker at the top and brighter at the bottom. So if we were to feed this into our ad and stop previewing, now we have a fill. We have an actual gradient fill to our button, which is really cool. But I kind of don't want it to go top down. I want it to go bottom up. So I'm actually going to flip this. And the way I'm going to flip this is I'm just going to subtract everything from 1. So let's talk about that math. What is 1 minus 1? 0. Okay, what is 1 minus 0? 1. So if you are looking at this image right here, let's do this here. Okay, if you're looking at this image on the right side, if we're going to take 1 minus every pixel in this image, all right, on the right side, if I take 1 and I subtract off 1, which is white, I get 0. On the left side, if I take 1 and I subtract off 0, which is black, I get 1. So that is effectively going to flip this gradient. So let's just do that and see what it looks like. So they even made a node for us. It's called 1 minus, and we can preview this. Okay, now remember we were looking left and right, so let me see if there's a better way to do that. Here, I know. Let's just, so for visualization purposes, let's just multiply this by 1. We'll preview this. So right now you'll notice that we have, it's dark on top and bright on the bottom, and it's basically just the vertical gradient multiplied by 1. Okay, then if we take and we subtract each of these pixels from 1 by doing a 1 minus, what ends up happening is this is going to flip around. So when I start previewing the node, you'll see that it flips around. Okay, cool. Now, maybe I want to make this an option. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but for now, let's just feed this in as a 1 minus and connect it in. And when we do that, when we take a look at our final image, this looks a lot more professional, if you will. Okay, now there are other things that we can do to increase the controllability of our now end-all be-all button texture. So one of the things I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to control the fall off of this gradient. How do we do that? Well, what we can do is we can use a little bit of understanding in math, and we can use a power node. So what does a power node do? The power node uses basically, based on your base, it takes an exponent, multiplies it through, and it effectively can use to erode your values. So if we take a look at this and we start previewing it, notice what it looks like when the power is 1. It is exactly what it was to start with. If I go to 2, it starts to erode a little bit. 3, 4, 5, 6. You'll see the higher the power, the more intense the gradient becomes, or actually the erosion of the gradient becomes. So this is just one way you often see as a means to mathematically erode a value. So if we stop previewing, you'll notice that our gradient is a lot more intense. Like it starts out a lot darker before it gets to the top. Now what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to control this. So perhaps we make this a variable, and what we can do is we can promote to it. It's not actually a variable in materials, it's actually called a parameter. The way I want to name this so that people understand what it is I want to call this the gradient. Let's actually type in the box, gradient fill, gradient erode, and its default value is going to be 1, and let's set the min to 1, and I'll show you why in a second, and we won't worry about the max. Okay, so let's apply that. We'll go ahead and save all this as well. All right, so what happens now if we go to 20, we have a very dark gradient. If we go 1, we get back to all blue. If we could technically change this to 0, what happens is anything to the power of 0 becomes solid. Actually, that might be okay. But what happens if we go negative actually on this? Actually, it still works. Let's do that. We'll keep 0 as an option. So let's see here. We're not even going to set mins and maxes. We'll just leave it there. And we're going to set our, but let's set our default gradient erosion to be 1. Oh wait, this is the default. There we go. So we have a nice default gradient. Now we can do the exact same thing up here for our border if we wanted to have a gradient on our border. So I'm going to copy and paste this. I'm going to call this border gradient erode. It's also going to be a linear gradient, going to have a power, etc., all of these things. And we are going to multiply this in. And we are going to connect that multiply out. Okay, so now you will notice that our border also has an erosion level to it as well. So I'm kind of on the fence as to whether or not I like that or how useful that might be, but it is an option. Let's see if we just, you know what, we'll keep it just as an option to have. But it's interesting. We'll see. It might be interesting to see how much that gets used. But overall, what we've done at this point is we've made it so that we can create material instances with a custom border color and a custom fill color that we can now use anywhere we want to. And we can actually, we have our ability to control our gradients and everything that goes with it. Now, we do have one more piece that I want to show you, and it's probably best if we just show you in context. So if we go to our third person game and we bring up our UI, all right, right now we are using this default UI intro button gray 64 by 64. We can actually use materials for our image values within buttons and UI elements and things like that for our style. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to our material, not search in here. I'm going to go back to browse to it here. And I'm actually going to do something called creating a material instance. Let me show you the difference here. If we create a material instance, I'm going to rename this to material instance, and I'm going to call this tutorial square, for example. Now by default, when I create a material instance, it gets all the default settings that are in the master material, okay, or in the main material. Now, you'll notice that because we created different parameters or variables, if you watch any of our videos, they're just called something different, we can actually now customize what this material instance is going to do. And we can do all this without having to recompile or reapply and all those kinds of things. So for now, let's just save this. Let's go back to our debug menu. And this time, instead of using this texture, let's go ahead and use our material instance tutorial square. Look at that. It populated. Looks great. Okay, we have our border issues as far as we need to set these. If you don't understand what all these mean, that we covered that in our last video, buttons and style, just as a heads up. But basically we need to set our border margins so that we don't get stretching. Now if we play, it's going to be hard. I don't know if you can see, you can kind of see it here. So there's one problem that we have not solved yet. If you notice, when we look at our button, even though it is the right color, it is not the right opacity. And it's because we have, you can see these black corners. These are not being cut out currently. And that is because we have not connected the black corners in our texture. Right now, there is nothing connected to our opacity mask. So what we can do is very simply connect our alpha straight into our opacity mask. And what that is going to do, now we're going to have to apply this with blueprints you compile, with materials you apply. So when we apply this, when we look at our material instance now, this is updated. And if we go back, you'll notice that we can now see through this material. We can see the checker marks behind our widgets. And the cool thing is, with our material square instance, we can very quickly come in here, because this was created as an instance, and we can update this to be any color we want. So for example, let's just change our border color. Whatever we change it to, it's pretty good. Let's call it that. Okay, we can change our fill color. When you check the box, now we can change our fill color to whatever we want. We can even go white, gray, anything we want. And as I explained, we also have access to our gradients. So if we want to increase the gradient, you'll notice that it's increasing both in the material instance preview and right on our UI, straight in our UI. And we can do the same thing with the border color. For example, if we go down to 0, we get a solid interior and we get a border color of such. So that is a quick demo of a few bits that go into the math behind materials that you can use in your UI layouts. Now, there's one thing that might be worth pointing out. When you're working with materials, it's very easy for the values to go below 0 and beyond 1, and you don't know what's happening. It's hard to see. So if you ever notice that you go to add 2 together or subtract 2 from each other and the result doesn't look right, it is entirely possible that you've gone beyond 1 or below 0. So you have 2 options. You can either clamp it. This will go ahead and create a clamp so that you know you're subtracting something that's between 0 and 1, or you can use a saturate. Saturate by default is a clamp. It will actually, you can see it clamps the value between 0 and 1. This is, and if you look at the text here, you can see it's free on most modern graphics hardware. That's why this exists. So hopefully that was cool. Quick little intro into using a texture, breaking it up so that we can use it as our basis, just basically 2 channels. And then by taking those 2 channels, using those as our masks, multiplying them by gradients and our own colors, we can effectively create our own buttons from scratch. Next time, or in a future video at some point, we may take a look at doing this procedurally, although the procedural versions of it can be a little bit more intense. So as always, any feedback is welcome. Thanks for taking time to check out the channel, watching the video. We have don't forget to check out our live section. We do a lot of our tutorials live, so they go into the live section in YouTube. We also have Discord, we have Patreon, and I'm Kevin. Thanks for taking the time. I'll see you on the next one. Later.